QuadrigaCX began in Canada at a time when crypto trading still felt like a niche activity. For many Canadians, it became a familiar gateway, a place to convert local currency into digital assets without needing overseas platforms. The brand grew through convenience, word of mouth, and a simple promise that buying and selling crypto could feel as normal as online banking. Under the surface, however, the exchange was unusually dependent on a small inner circle, especially its founder and CEO, Gerald Cotton. Over time, customers were not only trusting a platform, they were trusting a person. In its public image, QuadrigaCX looked like a modern startup. Fast onboarding, recognizable name, and the sense that it was Canada's exchange. But the real test of any exchange is not its interface, it is custody. How customer assets are stored, tracked, and protected, and operations, how deposits, withdrawals, accounting, and controls work when the market becomes stressful. Regulators later described a company with weak internal structure, limited separation of duties, and a level of centralization that would become a critical vulnerability. As activity increased, the exchange's daily routine became its identity. Customers deposited funds expecting quick access. Traders assumed withdrawals would work because they had worked before. And as long as transactions continued, it was easy for the public to believe the system was stable. That is how trust often forms in financial platforms, not through detailed verification, but through repeated habit. If a service works every day, people start treating it as safe. Yet the deeper story of QuadrigaCX was not a single bad day. It was a long period in which simple questions were hard to answer from the outside. Where exactly were customer assets stored? Who could approve transfers? Were customer holdings segregated from company funds? Did anyone independently verify balances? When companies grow quickly without building mature controls, they can appear healthy while quietly accumulating hidden risks. QuadrigaCX would later become a vivid example of how that gap between public confidence and internal reality can widen until it finally snaps. By the time the public realized something was deeply wrong, many customers had already left significant value on the platform. And in crypto, leaving funds on an exchange is more than storage. It is handing your assets to a custodian and relying on their discipline, record keeping, and honesty. QuadrigaCX's story would ultimately show what can happen when that reliance is placed on a system that lacks strong governance from the start. Inside QuadrigaCX, the operational model appears, based on later findings, to have been heavily centered around its CEO. In an ideal exchange, critical access is shared through structured processes, multiple approvals, documented procedures, and clear internal checks. QuadrigaCX, by contrast, was later described as having a fragile structure, where key access and decision making were concentrated. This is not just a technical flaw, it is an organizational risk. When one person holds too much control, the system may function quickly in good times, but it becomes extremely brittle when anything changes. As customers used the platform, they saw a familiar pattern. Deposits arrive, trades execute, withdrawals process, but operational reality can diverge from the customer-facing experience. Investigations later pointed to customer assets being moved in ways customers did not expect, including funds held on other platforms and in hot wallets, rather than being managed with strong custody separation. If true, that means the exchange account balance a user saw might not have matched a clearly segregated reserve kept safely in place. When an exchange lacks strong accounting discipline, a subtle drift can begin. A shortfall in one area can be temporarily patched by incoming deposits. Delays can be explained as banking friction. Confusion can be blamed on the market. In the moment, each issue may look ordinary. Over time, however, a pattern emerges. The platform becomes less a clean marketplace and more a moving set of internal improvisations. That kind of environment is dangerous because it depends on nothing going wrong for the illusion of normal operations to continue. Regulators later concluded that much of QuadrigaCX's collapse was not truly caused by a single event, but by a long-running fraud and misuse of client assets, including trading activity that created major losses and a growing deficit. In that view, the exchange was not simply disorganized, it was operating in a way that made customer withdrawals increasingly difficult to satisfy honestly over time. This stage of the story matters because it reframes what people think happened. Many early headlines focused on access issues and lost passwords, but the deeper lesson is operational. If a platform is already short on real assets, then any disruption, staff changes, market drops, banking friction, or leadership absence can instantly turn stress into collapse. QuadrigaCX was a case where internal weakness appears to have been building for a long time, while the public was mostly seeing a functioning storefront. In December 2018, QuadrigaCX announced that its CEO, Gerald Cotton, had passed away while traveling in India. The company later said he was the only person with access to key information needed to manage certain crypto holdings. The human side of this moment is real. Employees, partners, and customers were suddenly confronted with uncertainty, grief, and confusion at the same time. But for a financial platform, the operational implications were immediate and severe. Soon after, customers began reporting withdrawal problems and growing delays. When trust is shaken, customers don't just ask for explanations, they ask for access. and withdrawals are the ultimate truth test of an exchange. If users cannot withdraw, everything else, branding, market share, promises, becomes irrelevant. By late January 2019, the company's platform and website were shut down, and within days, Quadriga sought court protection from creditors in Canada. The situation shifted from an online service problem into a legal and financial emergency. People who had treated the exchange like a routine on-ramp now faced the reality that they might be creditors in a complex insolvency process. At the center of public discussion was a simple story. The keys were not accessible. But as monitors and investigators dug deeper, a harsher picture emerged. The issue was not only whether keys existed, but whether the assets they supposedly protected were ever there in the amounts customers believed. In other words, even if access could be restored, there was still the question of reserves. This is a crucial educational point. In custody systems, redundancy is not optional. A responsible platform plans for illness, absence, mistakes, and turnover. It documents access procedures. It uses shared controls. It ensures that if one person disappears, the system still works. QuadrigaCX's apparent dependence on one person was not just a bad practice, it became a central mechanism by which the entire platform could fail. As the news spread, customers and the broader crypto community experienced a familiar emotional pattern: disbelief first, then urgency, then anger, then exhaustion. Many were not trying to become investigators, they simply wanted clarity and a path forward. But clarity takes time, and in insolvency cases, time can feel like an additional loss layered on top of the financial one. When court-appointed monitoring began, Ernst & Young, EY, became involved as monitor and later trustee in the proceedings. Their role was not to tell a dramatic story, but to follow evidence, locate assets, examine records, and understand what happened to customer funds. This phase is where the public narrative often collides with documentation. As reports accumulated, it became increasingly difficult to treat the crisis as merely an access problem. Monitor findings and subsequent regulatory conclusions pointed toward a serious shortfall and significant mishandling of client assets. The story became less about a locked wallet and more about a company that appeared to have operated without the controls that would prevent misuse, hidden losses, and misleading internal accounting. From an educational perspective, this is where QuadrigaCX becomes a case study in operational integrity. A legitimate exchange must prove, internally and ideally externally, that customer balances correspond to real assets held in custody. If a company's records can be altered, or if internal accounts can be fabricated, the platform can create an illusion of solvency. Customers can trade against numbers on a screen that are not fully backed by reserves. That environment can persist until withdrawals accelerate or scrutiny increases. Then the illusion collapses. Regulators later concluded that Cotton created accounts under aliases and credited himself with balances that were not real, then traded against customers, generating large losses and using customer assets to cover gaps. In that view, QuadrigaCX was not simply disorganized, it was operating like an old-style fraud wearing modern branding. Even after this became clearer, the recovery process remained limited. In insolvency, finding assets is not the same as making people whole. Funds can be scattered, spent, or never properly segregated. Legal processes can preserve what remains, but they cannot easily rebuild what was never protected in the first place. This stage of the story carries a calm but powerful lesson. The most dangerous financial failures are not always loud. They can be quiet mismatches between records and reality, mismatches that customers cannot see until it is too late. QuadrigaCX taught many people that the real question is not, does the app work, but is the system honest, verifiable, and resilient when nobody is watching? In June 2020, staff at the Ontario Securities Commission, or OSC, published an investigative report that reached a clear conclusion. QuadrigaCX's collapse resulted from fraud committed by its founder. This mattered because it corrected a widespread misunderstanding. Many people had assumed the main cause was the CEO's passing and inaccessible keys. The OSC's view was that the core problem was much deeper. There was already a major asset shortfall driven by improper activity and losses, and customer funds were used in ways customers never agreed to. Reuters' coverage summarized key findings in plain terms. Investors collectively lost at least $169 million, and about $115 million of the shortfall was attributed to Cotton's trading activity, according to the regulator. That framing turned the QuadrigaCX story into something more concrete and less mysterious. The collapse was not a puzzle that only a password could solve. It was a breakdown of integrity and controls. This is also where the story becomes educational in the strongest way. QuadrigaCX was not merely an isolated failure, it was a warning about how easy it is for a centralized platform to simulate trust. When customers deposit into an exchange, they often assume the exchange is acting like a neutral marketplace. But if internal governance is weak, the exchange can become a counterparty that bets against its customers, hides losses, and covers gaps with new deposits. Users may not realize the difference until liquidity runs out. The OSC report described a system with inadequate record keeping, weak controls, and an environment where one person could shape the platform's internal truth. Those findings did not just explain the past, they offered a blueprint of what to watch for in the future: lack of transparency, poor segregation, concentrated access, and an absence of independent verification. For customers, this phase was bittersweet. On one hand, it provided clarity. On the other hand, clarity does not automatically restore funds. The insolvency and distribution process continued, shaped by legal constraints and whatever assets could be identified. The case became a long reminder that in crypto, once custody fails, recovery can be limited and slow, even when the facts eventually become clear. QuadrigaCX's story ends not with a neat resolution, but with a long tail of consequences. Insolvency proceedings moved through courts, reports, and creditor processes. EY's monitoring and trustee work documented the difficult reality of tracing assets after operational breakdown. In the years that followed, the case remained a reference point for regulators, lawyers, and everyday users trying to understand what safe should mean in crypto trading. The most important takeaway is not a technical trick or a dramatic rumor, it is a governance lesson. Custody must be designed for failure scenarios. A serious platform assumes that people will leave, systems will break, and markets will panic. It plans for continuity. It separates responsibilities. It audits internal records against real holdings. It makes deception difficult and accidental loss unlikely. QuadrigaCX appears to have lacked these protections, and the absence of them created a space where large harm could accumulate silently. For viewers, the educational value is deeply practical. When a platform asks you to trust it, trust should be earned through verifiable structure, clear custody practices, independent oversight, transparent reporting, and evidence that customer assets are not treated like a company's private pool. Convenience can be a powerful product, but convenience always shifts responsibility away from the user and onto the custodian. If the custodian is weak, the convenience becomes a hidden risk. QuadrigaCX also helped push a broader cultural shift in crypto: the recognition that being early does not protect you. Early markets can reward curiosity, but they can also punish misplaced confidence. A platform can feel legitimate because it is popular, local, and familiar, yet still be fragile behind the scenes. QuadrigaCX became a clear reminder that the difference between a stable exchange and a dangerous one is often invisible on the surface. In the end, this real Canadian case is not only about one company's failure, it is about what happens when modern technology is paired with old vulnerabilities: concentrated control, weak accountability, and records that cannot be trusted. QuadrigaCX showed that when governance fails, customers do not just lose access, they lose certainty, time, and peace of mind. And that is why in crypto especially, operational discipline is not a nice to have. It is the foundation that decides whether trust is justified or simply assumed.